In this video, we will talk about the religious landscape of Sindh before the Arab conquest. We will talk about what type of religious traditions were practiced in Sindh during this period. But before we do so, let's just first talk about what type of sources historians use to reconstruct this aspect of Sindh's history. As we have seen, when it comes to the political history of Sindh during this period, historians mainly rely on Chachnama. But when we want to know about the different type of religious traditions which Sindhis of this period practiced, we use Chachnama, but alongside Chachnama, when it comes to literary sources, we have the works of Huensang, the famous Chinese traveler, and apart from Huensang, we have the Arab accounts as well that talks about how Sindh was conquered. And apart from these literary sources, we have the archaeological sources also, where we can understand what type of religious structures during this period existed in Sindh. Now, generally, it is believed that the majority of Sindh during the Arab conquest was Buddhist. Historians who have argued this, they base their argument on the fact that when we read Arab sources, we find that two terms appear often. The first term is Buddha and the second term is Sumaniya. According to these scholars, the first term Buddha is the Arabic version of Buddha, whereas Sumaniya is the Arabic version of the Sanskrit term Shramana or the Pali term Samana. So the fact that these two terms appear often in Arab accounts when they talk about the religious landscape of Sindh means that the majority of Sindh was Buddhist. But a closer look at how these two terms have been used, particularly the term Buddha, tell us a different tale. Although it is true that this term Buddha is perhaps the corruption of Buddha, but in Arab accounts, this term is not always used to refer to Buddhist structures. Take for example how the famous 9th century Arab historian Al-Baladhuri describes a famous temple in Debal. He writes, and I quote, "A great Buddha on which there was a tall mast surmounted by a red banner unfurling with the wind over the city. The Buddha, which some say is a great tower, is utilized as a term for those structures in which they place one or more images for which it is renowned." Now, this description does not sound like the description of a Buddhist structure. Apart from this, some historians believe that the religious structure which Al-Baladhuri is talking about here is perhaps the same structure which Xuanzang has also talked about. Xuanzang describes this structure as a temple of Lord Maheshwar Dev, which is inhabited by the Pashupata sect. Then there are also archaeological evidence from Banbhor, which historians believe to be the site of Debal. From the excavations, we have found various Shivlingas and most importantly, traces of a Shaivite temple near the main Arab period mosque. The term Buddha is also used to describe the famous Sun temple at Multan. The Arab historian Al-Baladhuri, which we have already mentioned, while describing the famous Sun temple of Multan, writes, and I quote, "The Buddha al-Multan was a Buddha to which offerings were brought and vows pledged. The Sindhis came there on pilgrimage, circumambulated it, shaving their heads and beards before it." In fact, at one point in his Futuhu al-Baldan, Al-Baladhuri explicitly says everything which they honored in a religious way was called Buddha by them. Not only do we see the use of this term Buddha for Hindu and Buddhist religious structures, but in Arab sources, this term has also been used for a group of people and their region. The classical Muslim geographers, while describing the people who lived on the west bank of Indus, used the term Buddha for them, and the region itself is called Budhia. From all this, we can safely say that the term Buddha in Arab sources does not necessarily refer to Buddhist alone. But what about the second term, Sumaniya? In Arab sources, this term is often used in opposition with the term Barahima, which is the Arab version of Brahmana. And there is a general consensus among historians that when Arab sources use the term Sumaniya, they are using it for Buddhism as a religion or also for a group of Buddhists. Thus, we can say that unlike the term Buddha, we can be sure of the fact that when Arab sources uses the term Sumaniya, they are talking about something which is related to Buddhism. Now, having discussed all this, let's talk about the religious landscape of Sindh, and we will start with Buddhism. From Arab accounts, we can safely say that in Lower Sindh, Buddhists were present in significant numbers. The city of Nirun, which is what Arab accounts call modern Hyderabad, was governed by a succession of Buddhist governors. In the region of Budhia, which is located west of the Indus, we are told about a family of Buddhist monks who were called Kakah. The ancestors of this family were from the Gangetic plains. Mirpur Khas was also an important Buddhist center. From this site, archaeologists have discovered a Buddhist stupa that dates roughly back to 6th and 7th century AD. All in all, we can safely say that the Buddhists were present in significant numbers in the region of Budhia, which is located west of Indus. On the eastern bank from Mirpur Khas to south of Arod, the Buddhist presence was also strong. Interestingly, north of Arod, we do not find any Arab reference to Buddhist, which could suggest that in Upper Sindh, Buddhists were not dominant. Now, one question which arises from this is what kind of Buddhism was practiced in Sindh during this period? The Arab sources, unfortunately for us, does not have much to say about this aspect. But thankfully, the famous Chinese traveler Xuanzang had visited Sindh during the middle of 7th century AD. It is through his account we can get a detailed description of the Buddhist religious landscape of Sindh. Xuanzang tells us that there were 460 Buddhist monasteries with 26,000 monks. Of these 460 monasteries, 10 were in Multan, but they were in ruins and had no monks. In Makran, on the other hand, there were 100 monasteries with 6,000 monks. These 100 monasteries of Makran were jointly inhabited by the Mahayanists and the Hinayanists. Now, if you have paid attention to this description, you would say, what about the remaining 350 monasteries and 20,000 monks? Xuanzang tells us that these remaining 350 monasteries and 20,000 monks belonged to a sect called the Sammatiya. Now here I will not go into what kind of philosophical worldview this Buddhist sect had, but suffice it to say that this sect was a sub-branch of the Sthavirvadin sect. From the description of Xuanzang, it appears that the region of Sindh was the center of the Sammatiya sect. Xuanzang himself tells us that of all the Indian Sammatiya monks, half of them resided in Sindh. Some scholars argue that most of the Buddhists in Sindh became Sammatiyas only in the 7th century AD. Before this, they were Sarvastivadin. I believe that we do not have enough reference to prove this. Now, coming to Hinduism, from Arab accounts we can say that in Upper Sindh, Hinduism was the dominant religious tradition. But it does not mean that in Lower Sindh, Hinduism was not present. If we talk about the description of Xuanzang, he tells us that in Sindh there were 273 Hindu temples. Of these, 37 belonged to multiple sects. One was the famous Sun Temple of Multan, whereas the remaining 235 temples belonged to the Pashupata Shaivites, which would mean that Shaivism was dominant in Sindh. Xuanzang also found a concentration of Pashupata temples in eastern Makran. He also talks about how in the capital of Sindh there was a great Shaiva temple that was inhabited by the Pashupat sect. We have also talked about how he described the great temple at Deobal, which was also inhabited by the Pashupat sect. Apart from this, in Shiv Puran we read about the holy waters of river Sindhu. and the religious merit which one earns when they bathe in a lake that was located at the juncture of river Indus. Interestingly, from Jhukar, which is located some 6 miles west of Larkana, we have found terracotta seals that have the inscription of Hara, Shiv, the wearer of skulls. Alongside the worship of Lord Shiva, we also have great evidence about the worship of the sun god Surya. The center of this religious tradition was the city of Multan, which during this time was called Moolsthan. The Chinese traveler Xuanzang calls this city Moolsthanpura. And while describing the famous sun temple of Moolsthanpura, he writes, and I quote, "There is a temple dedicated to the sun, very magnificent and profusely decorated. The image of the Surya Dev is cast in yellow gold and ornamented with rare gems. Its divine insight is mysteriously manifested and its spiritual power made plain to all. Women play their music, light their torches, offer their flowers and perfumes to honor it. Men from all countries come here to offer up their prayers. There are always some thousands doing so." Although Multan was the center of this religious tradition, it does not mean that it was not practiced in other parts of Sindh. If we talk about Brahminabad, archaeologists have found elaborate stone frames of Lord Surya, which suggest that in Brahminabad, this religious tradition was also present. If we talk about the other sects of Hinduism, they certainly flourished in Sindh. This Murti, for instance, you are seeing here is the Murti of Lord Brahma, and it was unearthed from Mirpur Khas, which is in southeast Sindh. From Debal, we have found fragments of a Murti of Lord Vishnu. Now, there are also some scholars who believe that the practice of worshipping Uderolal, who is believed to be an incarnation of Lord Varuna, also existed during this period. We can say this because the Sendhav dynasty, which was formed by the Sindhi migrants who came from Sindh to Kutch in the 8th and 9th century, they had the symbol of fish. The symbol of fish was also the symbol of Lord Varuna, which suggests that these Sindhi migrants worshipped Lord Varuna. So this is the speculation which these scholars make, that the worshipping of Lord Varuna existed even in 8th or 7th century Sindh. Now, on the surface, based on the archaeological and literary sources, one could have the perception that there was a clear distinction between the followers of these different religious traditions. But in reality, this need not have to be the case, because a Sindhi who was living in a village during this time can have his belief in Lord Buddha, and at the same time he could worship Lord Shiva. In my view, this type of religious plurality existed among the common folks. But when we talk about the elite section, particularly monks or priests, we can say that there was a distinct sectarian identity. So this particular point I think we should keep in mind. Now, apart from these different sects of Hinduism and Buddhism, in Arab sources we also find the mention of Majus, which is used for Zoroastrians or fire worshippers. This could mean that there were Zoroastrians in Sindh, or it could also mean that the Arabs mistook Hindus as Zoroastrians. In my view, both could be true. There were some Zoroastrians, particularly in the western border of Sindh, and there is also the case that some Arab accounts mistook Hindus as fire worshippers or Zoroastrians. Now, you can watch this playlist to know about the political history of Sindh before the Arab conquest. If you like this channel, do subscribe. Thank you for watching.